Hello folks, and welcome to the Rifle Company Butterworth podcast. My name is Sean Arthur, and I am one of the 9,000 Rifle Company Butterworth veterans who have served at Butterworth Air Force Base in Malaysia. In this series, we're going to explore the hidden story of one of the longest conflicts in the Australian Army's military history. In duration, it was second only to the war in Afghanistan. Australia was involved in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, almost 20 years. However, long before Afghanistan, there was another long conflict that lasted from 1970 to 1989. That was a full 19 years. Weirdly, this conflict has been erased from the Australian Defence Force's military record. Or should I say, it was never permitted to enter the record in the first place. This was Rifle Company Butterworth, that is, RCB's long defence of the Air Force Base in Butterworth, situated in northern Malaysia. In this podcast, I will get into the official investigations of the RCB service, particularly the 2023 DHAAT Tribunal. I will explain how, for the most part, the official decisions have been self-serving, illogical, and how they played fast and loose with the established facts. RCB has experienced many inquiries over the decades. Some were full-blooded formal investigations, and some were half-assed kangaroo courts. Some where the veterans were barely represented, and our views were summarily dismissed without proper examination. We have often appealed, and we have sought out and sometimes even received meetings with government ministers. Sometimes the politicians were even open to having frank investigations into our claims. But even earnest and frank discussions have led to the very same sewage farm that the dismissive talks have taken us. At every inquiry, the Defence Department gets called in, and immediately the old training lie is reverently taken out of its storage box and displayed to the Minister or the House of Reps. No real examination takes place. RCB is soon declared to be a peacetime service, and that is that. Forget the facts and even forget the logic of the official position. It quickly dissolves into veterans taking a long walk off a very short pier. Still, the RCB veterans, to the annoyance of everyone concerned, and in truth, even including the veterans themselves, we persist. The truth must out. The thing is, dear listener, I have been dreading this chapter. The whole tribunal rigmarole is just so damn complicated, and the reasons the veterans have put forward in supporting our claim are just too damn evident. And so much legal sausage has been created by the inquiry process that asking the listener to eat it all in a single sitting is almost cruel. My friend, this is what I'm asking you to do. I hope that you haven't had a big lunch. The investigative details are infinitesimal and frankly boring for the uninvolved listener. If a tribunal sits for 6 months taking evidence, then deliberates for another 6 months, and then puts out a whopping report about the size of a family Bible, how am I to explain all that in a single podcast? It's very difficult. And that is just one formal investigation, the 2023. There have been so many others. Sometimes hours of debate rests on the legal definition of a single word. What is permitted? What is the definition of risk? What is threat? What is expectation? How are the ROE framed, rules of engagement? What do they even mean? And how do they all relate to casualties, inverted commas? It's a lawyer's picnic. These legal bafflements go on for days and days. This rubbish, lightly floating above our heads, was the very air the veterans breathed. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of asbestos that we were hailing into our souls. Many times the basic logic of proven facts was relegated to a tortured alternative reasoning, one that left the entire crew of RCB veterans listening either amused, furious, or sometimes both at the same time. However learned they might have been in administrative law, or naval operations, or flight sorties, They got lost in the mire of infantry operations from 40, 50 years ago. Us helpless grunt spectators watched them tangle themselves in knots over subjects that were quite easily explainable to the old men sitting quietly in the peanut gallery. Our operations had a specific military objective, and that was performed during the Cold War. It is asking a lot for civilians, even naval or RAAF officers comprising the tribunal members, to appreciate infantry taskings, or the enemy, or the multitude of army tactical procedures. It was pure historical Cold War stuff, the like of which hasn't seen the light of day in decades. The only true, genuine experts on RCB operations were the RCB veterans themselves, and also the associated RAAF operational intelligence staff at the time. Yet nobody took our claim seriously because of an underlying belief that we were biased. We were the only ones that could be biased, apparently. No one else could. Or they offered counter-explanations for unchallenged facts that were just plain bonkers. The Defence Department also sowed confusion by denying everything whilst not troubling themselves in providing any evidence of their version. How do I even tackle this demonic subject with you, my friends? I have been chewing over all of this for many, many years, and the struggles are barely within my reach. So after much pondering, I did land upon a methodology in trying to explain to you the long, complicated and sloppy mess of previous inquiries into RCB service. That is, I'm mostly going to ignore them, with a few side departures, and concentrate on the most recent tribunal to our time in Malaysia, the 2023 DHAAT Tribunal. This tribunal's formal title was called the Inquiry into Medallic Recognition for the Service with Rifle Company Butterworth 2023. By largely ignoring previous inquiries, it significantly shortens the explanation, but it does lose out in not demonstrating much of the government's previous notorious shortcomings. However, as the official record on the 2023 DHAAT Tribunal itself states, none of the previous inquiries into RCB service were fair, accurate, nor equitable in any way. Nothing is going to be lost, as this tribunal was supposedly going to wipe the slate clean and start afresh, or so they claimed. I will state now at the very beginning, and I will repeat it throughout this podcast, that the 2023 tribunal was the fairest hearing that the RCB ever experienced to date. At first, the language used for the first time was reasonably neutral. Also, the tribunal, for the first time to the veterans' ears, gave the Defence Department a jolly good shellacking. Many of the Defence's previous illogical explanations, their obstructions and their outright deceptions were exposed, and in some detail. To quote directly, "It seems to the tribunal that, colloquially speaking, Defence has been making up as it goes." Close inverted commas. Prior to the first public hearing, during the review phase, the tribunal had evidently been doing their homework. I must say, hearing all this open departmental critique for the first time was a tonic. The Defence Department was getting called out time and time again on simple truths. It was good for the RCB soul to hear it. We had been saying much of these same things for years, but the department always, and I do mean always, in the end, found a soft and sympathetic ministerial ear. The very first paragraph of the tribunal's final report allows that the RCB Infantry Company at Butterworth had a primary purpose of defending the Butterworth Air Base against attack from the armed communist terrorists, or CTs, and the subunits operated under a cover of training for diplomatic nicety or political expedience. This was the very first flipping paragraph, and it should have been case closed right there. RCB was not there for training purposes. The training lie was for diplomatic correctness and public consumption. We were there for only one reason: the defence against enemy attack, and that was pure war service. This was a very vital point, because the Defence Department had been aggressively arguing otherwise for more than 3 decades. If RCB's primary contribution was active, armed defence against attack from CT aggressors, then our entire claim of warlike service has been addressed in the report's opening paragraph in the executive summary. We would soon learn that the Tribunal, in its wisdom, proceeded to invent unnecessary shades of grey and sliding degrees of meanings that were not, nor would never have been, a measure for qualifying war service. More about that later. At the very beginning of the first public hearing, the Tribunal hinted that whatever else RCB service might prove to be, it certainly wasn't peacetime service. To say it was so was a nonsense. So for the very first time since 1970, it was openly recognised that RCB service wasn't peacetime service, and it was recognised officially. This may or not have the same impact to the listener as it does to the RCB veteran, but 1970 was a long time ago, and this untrue statement was the principal structure that supported almost the entire fallacious edifice. While the RCB veterans had not been declared victor in the Tribunal battle, at least yet, we began to grow some confidence in the process. Alas, we experienced premature elation, because what was to follow shattered the illusion. The Tribunal had got all the facts it needed, and then began to draw conclusions that nobody could have anticipated, and they remained stubborn as to the simple and ordinary explanations as to those facts. In some ways, having a lawyer in charge and him misinterpreting ordinary facts was a mistake. In many ways, a plumber or an accountant might have done a better job in making the call. Sometimes a stick really is a stick, and not as a lawyer might put it, a biological artifact historically removed from the continuing biosphere and converted into an insensate limb devoid of function apart from natural decay. I will go into some of these matters illustrating my central point, but it will probably give you a headache to hear them. On the plus side, the Tribunal agreed with the veterans on many crucial ingredients. Most of these points led, or should have led, to a single outcome. RCB service was not peacetime service, the Tribunal declared, but that still left a couple of other alternate options. It left hazardous service, an outcome that was also previously recommended for us years before, but the Defence Department forgot to certify it. Hazardous service is 2 steps below warlike service. The other option is non-warlike service, which is immediately below warlike. I appreciate that all the variations of service sound like gobbledygook, but that is the system we are stuck with. These incremental steps, with their mystifying differences, would be as confusing to you as it is to us. In 2006, the RCB veterans were awarded the Australian Service Medal, the ASM. This medal can only be awarded for operational service, and no other kind. So while the government awarded us this recognition, the Defence Department still claimed that we were there for peacetime service only, a circumstance which would have denied us the same award. So what is it, chaps? Were we peacetime or operational? If so, why the ASM? Because that award is not applicable for peacetime service. It is this kind of brutish idiocy that the military bureaucracy continually played that made me wonder if the Defence Department as a whole had been dropped on its collective head as a baby. Quite accidentally, the RCB veterans have been led into a long one-way corridor by our repeated arguments that our service wasn't peacetime. So prior to the first public hearing into our case, the Tribunal received over 100 submissions from RCB veterans providing endless proofs that we were not peacetime. Much time was wasted on our non-peaceful status that might have been better spent on addressing more significant topics. So while it might have been a pleasant shock to discover that the Tribunal was already on side with us against peacetime service, we had wasted much valuable time in trying to prove something that the Tribunal didn't seem to find all that contentious. To save time here, I won't cover the same old ground, such as the repeated patrolling against the enemy, being always heavily armed on duty, etc., and concentrate on areas where the Tribunal got lost in the RCB swamp that always seems to trap the unwary. First of all, the tribunal got caught on the sticky web of the two surviving Joint Intelligence Organisation, that's JIO, strategic assessments. The Defence Department absolutely loved these two documents, dated from 1974 and 1975, because they incorrectly claimed that there was no threat to Air Force Base Butterworth. This was not even remotely true. A simple reading of the text never outlines a lack of threat. The said documents were rather quite alarming, as they detailed Butterworth was surrounded by active communist insurgency. The reports named all the enemy units by name and all the weaponry available to the CTs. It was so alarming to the RAAF that they started to petition the government for urgent air-based defensive upgrades, particularly for protective berms as protection against rocket attack. The Australian High Commission at Kuala Lumpur shot off urgent signals to Canberra asking for monies for this purpose. So the base defences were seriously upgraded because of these two intelligence documents. The offending line for us was that at time of writing, both in 74 and 75, that an external ground attack was considered unlikely. That is, external. But this is a civil war. All the threat was internal. Not to mention that these strategic documents have a perishable warning date. Usually it is about 12 months for a threat indication to remain valid, because no over-the-horizon warning can appear beyond that. Intelligence is perishable. And if not as perishable as milk, then perhaps just as perishable as tea or peanut butter. When Churchill received intelligence that the Germans were preparing an invasion of Great Britain in 1940, was that still the case in 1942? No, of course not. For instance, in the case of RCB, neither strategic intelligence document predicted possible adverse outcomes due to the South Vietnamese government falling, for the very good reason that at the time, the South Vietnamese government hadn't, as yet, fallen. The intelligence documents didn't take into account the availability of additional North Vietnamese arms and ammunition that suddenly became available for CT use. In fact, this most critical strategic incident of the entire region and the entire period wasn't mentioned at all. In fact, it could be mentioned for obvious reasons. They didn't predict the Vietnam War going bad. The DHAAT Tribunal seemed to ignore most of the intelligence document with all its rich nuance and specificity, and just hone in on a single line suggesting that an external ground attack was unlikely for the next 12 months. And the key word was external. By definition, a civil war is an internal conflict. These documents were already seriously out of date, not to mention very confusing, before they even went to print. Meanwhile, the local RAAF tactical intelligence was beeping madly. They were reporting on CT incidents surrounding Airbase Butterworth all the time over the years. This meant that the base was forever on alert because of continual CT activity. An RAAF Amber Alert means imminent threat, and for the long duration of RCB service, this happened at least monthly, and sometimes for periods far less than that. All this direct local tactical intelligence evidence was provided to the tribunal, in all its dull yet critical detail. Incident after incident, alert after alert, year after year, the base observed the same worrying alarms. But the tribunal, bless their socks, preferred these two summary reports from Canberra. Each had a single reassuring line saying that things might be hunky-dory, for a little while at least. Both documents were from the mid-1970s, and yet both were claimed by the Defence Department to address the full 19 years covering the Second Malaysian Civil War, by virtue of no other evidence of the kind being presented. Now we come to casualty expectations. The tribunal decided that an expectation of casualties must be a defining element for qualifying service. In this, they are technically correct, but nobody has ever managed to provide a waterproof, universal explanation how one might define this ingredient that would satisfy all warlike service. When you try to tie down expectation, you begin to discover that all wars and all conflicts suffer unique characteristics. If you bolt on one definition, you might exclude some other military deployments that had different yet dangerous experiences. Not all warlike deployments involve violent enemy contact, nor even enemy or friendly deaths or casualties. If none occur, and often they don't, then how does one meaningfully express expectations? The threat might be there, even an extreme threat, yet thankfully one might not happen. Such was the case of the conflict in East Timor, 1999 to 2013. Australian casualties did happen in that theatre, but they were mercifully rare, and thankfully experienced no Australian soldiers killed in action. But did that mean that none were not to be expected? No. And of course, casualties might also occur without expectation. War is a funny thing. War doesn't necessarily follow administrative or legislative definitions. What is reasonable, instead, is to look at the total threat and realistically examine what if the worst thing was to happen under those circumstances. What are the men prepared to face, and what exactly might happen to them? And what preparations were put in place to assist them if it became necessary? The veterans attest that when personnel are placed in harm's way to pursue a military objective by force, that situation itself creates an expectation of casualties. How could it not? It is actually easier to define that expectation by listing all the mitigation factors employed by the Australian forces that went into trying to address potential casualties at Airbase Butterworth. The primary characteristic must be the predicate purpose for the Australian troops being on site at Airbase Butterworth in the first place. The answer is that the opposing forces, in our case the CTs, had a military and political purpose in attacking the airbase, and they had the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity to do so at any time of their choosing. They could also decide not to attack, but whether they did so or not, RCB troops obviously did not get a vote in that decision. The Defence Department attempted to put forward the argument that Australia was not at war. Therefore, the CTs were not our enemy. The Tribunal rightfully squished this argument by saying that if the CTs chose to attack, they would automatically become our opposing military force. Even the JIO reports mentioned earlier said that the CTs would make no material distinction between the Malaysian armed forces and the Australian military forces if it came down to an attack. So whether it is unpalatable to the military bureaucrats or not, RCB always had a potential enemy and under all circumstances. RCB did have an expectation of battle casualties, and the plain evidence is as follows. Our soldiers had enhanced battle casualty aid training, including the treating of battle wounds. The Tribunal apparently misunderstood how infantry attacks work. Open exposure to firefights is a fundamental expectation of casualties. The base medical facilities were equipped for mass casualties on the evidence of the RAAF base hospital director. The range and type of weaponry used by the opposition can cause devastating injury as well as death. The CTs routinely engaged the Malaysian security forces and caused multiple casualties and death. And the threat posed by enemy forces realistically equaled an expectation of casualties. The CTs were expert at booby traps and would routinely place such set-and-forget weapons without exposing themselves to risk of counterattack. This negates the suggestion that only the Malaysian security forces were targeted. It is difficult, no, it is impossible to choose a victim with booby traps. RCB was part of the Shared Defence Plan, which has a component for dealing with casualties, so an expectation was official, included, and necessary element of the plan. The RAAF base commander refused to permit all the company elements away from Airbase Butterworth at the same time, which is a recognition that an enemy attack was always to be expected. That wasn't the RCB installing that law, that was the RAAF. The RCB had triple their normal allocations of ammunition, highlighting that attack was an expectation. An attack means probable casualties, which is an unfortunate, though expected historic feature of Australia's military deployments. I'd like to cover briefly rules of engagement, ROE. I don't want to, but I'm forced to do it really. The Tribunal got completely bogged down on our rules of engagement. As a matter of course, they turned the rules on their head. This was partly because of the inclusion of a particular element found in a single copy of the ROE discovered. That inclusion asked all soldiers if shooting was necessary, that they would try and shoot to wound rather than kill. To a man, the RCB veterans thought that this inclusion was nuts. You, the listener, have already heard what weapons an infantry fire team have at their disposal. If we, a rifle section, let alone a company, found it necessary to open fire, we would have obliterated the target. That's the design of the weapons. The Army didn't issue Nerf guns and our bullets weren't foam. Our assault weapons were incredibly powerful and incredibly lethal. The M60 doesn't shoot in a narrow beam but sprays out bullets in a pattern and was designed to suppress a group target. Anything we hit on the human body is going to sting more than a little bit. Wounding just doesn't come into it. Additionally, I myself, nor other veterans present, had never seen or even operated under this version of the ROE. The one copy of the ROE available to the Tribunal had the wounding inclusion, but it postdated my tour. Most veterans had never heard of it before and thought the requirement ludicrous. But the Tribunal cherished this version of the ROE because they believed that it supported a general self-defence posture for the RCB. Then, on the spot, they invented a characteristic for the ROE that trying to wound meant command intent. That is, by its inclusion, the Australian government itself intended a de-escalation intention, whatever that meant. A true de-escalation intention would be better alluded to by not giving the RCB guns and ammo. Even better, by just issuing us with tennis rackets. However, the government didn't do that. They signalled their real command intention by sending the RCB into a war zone and giving us the full allotment of infantry weapons required to recover the airbase from enemy attack. While the RCB veterans were still trying to grapple how to wound and not kill a person who was probably also armed and capable of shooting us, the Tribunal waxed on about the limiting factors of deliberate de-escalation. There are so many things wrong with this on-the-hop, rapper-style, free-flowing interpretation of known and recorded events. The veterans pointed out the self-evident truth that shooting to wound with machine guns is pretty much impossible, that a wounding cannot be summoned into existence under those conditions, especially at night if encountering a possibly armed individual. The Defence Department knew that the wounding inclusion in the ROE was utter bullshit, and they also knew that it couldn't defend compulsory wounding, so they went on another tack. Defence said that it was a failure on us, the common soldiers, that we didn't bring this impossibility of wounding to the attention of RAAF command. So a stupid inclusion foisted upon us was somehow also our fault and not that of the genius who put it there in the first place. As I mentioned before, nobody present had ever seen this inclusion in the ROE previously. Other deployments may have, we never did. There is a strong suggestion that this ROE may not even refer to the rifle company. That might have been designed for RAAF dog handlers who were armed only with a much less lethal Browning 9mm service handgun. That would make a lot more sense. The Tribunal called a Professor Dale Stevens, an academic and international expert on ROE, and also an Australian Reserve Naval officer. Professor Stevens stated that there can only ever be a general relationship between the issued ROE and the actual threat level faced by the deployed ADF members. The Tribunal interpreted this to mean that there actually is, or should be, a direct relationship. Stevens said the word general quite intentionally. In my view, Professor Stevens was actually arguing the opposite. In armed conflict, one can't anticipate the level of threat as a single standard for the entire deployment, particularly over 19 years. Threat can ebb and flow, not stand immobile for all time. Strictly speaking, a threat level is not a static feature of any given conflict, and believing otherwise has led the Tribunal into an unsound supposition. The Tribunal changed Stephen's actually plainly worded statement to give meaning that I very much doubt that the professor intended. What Stephens was saying, what he literally said, was that at best, only a general relationship between ROE and the threat can exist. To assume otherwise, one must have access to the mind of the enemy. The ROE must be flexible, or, if not updated with wearisome regularity, to conform with the never-changing threat threshold. That is precisely why the relationship must be general. If the Tribunal did change Stephen's basic principle 180 degrees, as I suggest it did, then what is further built upon it becomes increasingly problematic. Rules of engagement are directives designed to regulate the application of military force consistent with government policies and legal obligations. In addition to giving a voice to government intent, whatever that means, given that the government is not on patrol with us, offering us advice on the trot, the ROE also reflects command intent. Key to the proper interpretation of ROE is an understanding of command intent and how it is expressed through its rules. All one can definitely say about rules of engagement is that it provides legal authority to take offensive action and the boundaries under which that action may be undertaken. To impose government or command intent has little or nothing to do with it. Obviously, ROE imposes limitations. This can happen in a warlike or non-warlike setting. It is not, by itself, determinative of one state over another. But if one has to make the call, having the authority to legally shoot someone to death once a defining condition has been reached, then that circumstance can only be relegated to a warlike setting. That's the only thing that an ROE points at. The single limitation is that the ROE restricts or prevents the soldier from first taking defensive action unless an agreed precondition is met. The soldier on the ground is the ultimate judge of when that preventative limitation has been breached and when the authorised legal action can take place. If you want to impose a command or national intent, it is really locked solely inside the legal restriction itself. But the rest of the ROE is predicated on what happens if the aggressor steps outside the nominated restriction. At that point, the legal authorisation kicks in and the soldier is authorised to remove the threat up to and including taking a life. In Afghanistan, for instance, the ROE permitting lethal offensive action, including a suspect carrying a radio, even if they were otherwise unarmed. That is why they call them rules of engagement. The Tribunal, in its search for a golden determining feature of non-warlike, started probing within the permitted rules of armed combat. One might look and compare other ROE and other recent conflicts and see legal barriers in them too. They exist in every ROE because they must exist. They are the rules of warfare. However, because they include limitations, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not warlike. If so, we can discount a great many historical armed deployments as being non-warlike. If the RCB took offensive action under the ROE legally, it still may have caused great offence to the Malaysian government, or even have created an international incident that would have been very unwelcome to the Australian government and unwanted to the Defence Department. It depends upon the circumstances of the engagement. It would most definitely expose the pretext that the RCB deployment was only in country for peaceful training purposes. It wasn't training in the slightest, but we mustn't let that cat out of the bag. Australians shooting up CTs on base would have really upset the apple cart. There is nothing intrinsically built into the ROE that signals political or command intent anyway. One has to make the assumption, and that is a pretty dangerous game. By virtue of the simple rules of the ROE, any private soldier could take lethal action after an ignored challenge. Government or High Command has no overriding say in the matter after that first shot has been fired. It is the legal authority to take action, and if anything, it's up to the courts to decide otherwise. Here the tribunal is clearly examining the chicken entrails of the ROE for signs of non-warlike, and in doing so, allegedly, probably verbal and noted international expert on ROE. ROE may not even involve verbal challenge under some circumstances. To quote, and this is the quote, "If you yourself or any other person authorised to be in the protected place are being attacked from inside or outside the protected place in such a way as to give you no time to challenge, and you have reason to fear that death or grave bodily injury will result, you may fire without challenging." This is part of our ROE, and it also says that we may fire outside the protected place, which is outside the wire, something that everyone has been telling us for years that we were not permitted to do under any circumstances, yet the ROE says we could. As stated earlier, this version of the ROE was possibly originally written for RAAF guards. This ROE was subsequently and supposedly supplied to the Army, who obviously were not sentries. However, this state of affairs was never challenged or rescinded by Army instructions later on. Counter-penetration or counter-attack is a deliberate full-on battle, as were other combat activities of the Army QRF once activated. What type of circumstance would permit an instant lethal response by the RCB? I would suggest the normal warlike situation, such as a surprise encounter with armed insurgents when a shouted warning would otherwise let them, to use a colloquial expression, get the drop on you, or say, a real QRF call-out. So much ink has been wasted upon the ridiculous shoot-to-wound restraint in the ROE that it's not worth going into it much deeper. The tribunal states, and this is a quote, "However impractical, the tribunal considered that the direction to shoot to wound and not to kill was consistent with the general thrust of Op. Ord 11/68 and supported the view that the perception of the operating environment at the time was sufficiently benign to allow ROE to principally focus on arrest procedures." The "however impractical" bit kills me. The acknowledgement that something is impossible, but telling you that the impossible must still be carried out nonetheless. Priceless. Not to mention arrest procedures. What? This police role has never been put forward by anyone previously and is completely unsupported by any evidence. This seems to be a pure invention of the tribunal. Otherwise, their self-defense narrative risks becoming seriously unstuck. We carry no handcuffs or any other restraints. Show me the money otherwise. As stated earlier, government or command intent in regards to ROE is neither here nor there. Whether a non-compliant intruder lives or dies after being shot up by the RCB is a matter for the hospital or the undertaker. As long as the soldier performs the action in accordance with the ROE, he is legally authorised to take that action. The tribunal has chosen to impose extra-legal impositions upon the basic rules or give meaning not implicitly stated in the rules, and it's highly challengeable, in my view. To date, the word hasn't totally gotten around to agreeing to the prohibition of the enemy being killed by infantry, especially when it is legal and necessary and authorised to do so. Let's look at the Quick Reaction Force, the QRF. The tribunal got into a wrestling match about the QRF. Were they sentries or were they a patrol? They were neither, as any soldier could simply attest. And as the veterans plainly said, the RCB veterans refused to accept either designation, and it appeared to annoy the tribunal, but that is not our fault. A sentry, whether static or mobile, is acting the part of a guard. The Quick Reaction Force is a military offensive force, exactly as on the label, and it is designed to immediately react against hostile actors that are known to be present. It is an on-call force, an immediate active reserve, ready to take on any non-specific threat. To my mind, equating the QRF to a self-defense force is stretching the question beyond snapping point. If having ROE protection is an essential element, a deal breaker, if you will, what are the documented cases where the QRF operated outside the wire? This happenstance must therefore necessitate the same ROE protection when operating outside the wire as for inside the wire, because guarding crashed aircraft was definitely an outside the wire scenario. However, the deficiency of evidence for the ROE in external operations doesn't explain the lack of ROE protection for them either. The tribunal conveniently leaves the question unanswered. So what was it? Was the QRF, when operating outside the wire, acting illegally with the full knowledge of the senior RAAF commanders? According to the tribunal, yes, unless it redefines the QRF into another thing. The one repeated fact, and acknowledged by every party, was that the RCB could not conduct any military operations beyond the wire. And yet we did. We did so all the time. RCB service was warlike, and that the QRF was a permissible use of authorised force, even under the rules. If we were to return to the actual uncontested wording, ROE may not even involve verbal challenge. The QRF was designed to remove an identified threat. If the airbase was under attack, the ROE would permit and authorise a lethal action even without challenge. They say so in the ROE itself. The tribunal puzzled over the fact that RCB should include terrible weapons such as the M60 GPMG. A medium machine gun of large calibre and high rate of fire, the M60 pretty much guarantees that a shoot-to-wound policy is a fairy tale. The suggestion that it is a bit of a mystery for the DHAAT tribunal as to why such a destructive weapon should be enshrined in the QRF because of its profound unsuitability in limiting casualties under the ROE. This chin-stroking question explains more about the tribunal's comprehension of infantry operations than it does about its attempt to force a non-warlike narrative under any circumstances. It really isn't the mystery that it has been made out to be. RCB carried the M60 on RCB operations because infantry carried the M60 at all times. It all makes sense if you would just accept that the RCB service was warlike. So naturally, why would we degrade our offensive capability by dropping the gun from RCB service? That's the bit that makes no sense. The tribunal goes further, and this is a direct quote. There were also some claims that the ROE used by the RCB were close to identical to those used in Vietnam and East Timor. The tribunal interpreted this as a contention that the RCB ROE lent support to the conclusion that RCB service was warlike. The tribunal did not analyse the ROE used in either Vietnam or East Timor, nor did it see a direct comparison of ROEs as being essential to the outcome of this inquiry. End quote. When Professor Stevens said that the Butterworth ROE was near identical to that of Afghanistan, that was the last we heard from that statement. It really shanked the tribunal's notion of non-warlike nature for RCB service. They just never addressed it at all again, as it was extremely damaging to their argument. Further quotes from the tribunal on ROE, and I quote, "However, the tribunal considered it extremely unlikely, given the discord it generated at public hearings, that either of these ROE directed ADF personnel to shoot to wound, not to kill. Nor is it surprising that the ROE authorised under Malaysia's Protected Areas and Protected Places Act 1959 were nothing like the free fire zones of Vietnam." End of quote. The tribunal's words about this were clumsy and difficult to understand. They seem to be agreeing that Butterworth ROE may well have been near identical with other conflicts such as Vietnam. However, so what? Our ROE was not like Vietnam in any respect. But the veterans never claimed that Butterworth was a free fire zone. We just said that the ROE for both conflicts were near identical, which makes the ridiculous dismantling of the ROE in search of qualifying service indicators is futile. The Tribunal concedes that it never analysed nor made a direct comparison between the ROE of either Vietnam nor East Timor. While the Tribunal may not have done so, Professor Stevens, as the Tribunal's own summoned witness and as an accepted international expert on the subject, certainly did. Once again, the shoot-to-wound inclusion trumps even open admission that all the nominated ROEs in uncontested wars were not particularly dissimilar. Stevens even added Afghanistan. Nobody is suggesting that the air-based Butterworth was anything like the Vietnamese free fire zones. In Vietnam, the Australians operated in an environment where all civilians had been cleared off the land, at least at night time, and the only remaining people in the country were the enemy. That distinction makes it a free fire zone, not a busy working airbase on the outskirts of a populated town. Also, the Tribunal, along with the defence, appears frightened with making any comparisons between the different deployments. It just avoids doing so, and we are entitled to ask why. The Tribunal report asserts that the ROE was de-escalatory. This is interesting in that it quotes Professor Stevens as describing our ROE possibly having competing states. One was de-escalatory and the other was status quo maintenance. If the status quo bit was a state of active defence against external hostile actors, then the other alternative is that the ROE was objectively leaning towards warlike. Given that Stevens allowed two descriptors were in play, the Tribunal went with the only one that supported its non-warlike narrative. Professor Stevens supported a warlike alternative. In his letter to the RCB veterans in 2022, that Professor Stevens, an international expert on ROE, plainly said that RCB deployment as warlike was very supportable and that the threat was objectively high. However, two strategic intelligence reports at the time saying the attack was unlikely, though never eliminated, appears to trump Stevens' analysis. This highlights an absolute refusal to contemplate comparable service in addressing risk. Stevens was just not looking at RCB through 1970 lens. He talked a great deal about modern deployments and fitted Butterworth alongside undeniable shooting conflicts. But the Tribunal, on receiving this unpalatable advice, once again retreated to a few surviving dusty documents as a source of refuge. No authoritative but competing view was ever going to upset a non-warlike outcome. The Tribunal is a judicial body. Superficially, the DHAAT Tribunal resembles a courtroom. It even has many of the attributes of a court of law. It has witnesses, it takes evidence, it has sworn oaths or affirmations, and has many other binding procedures. But a DHAAT Tribunal is not a court of law. It more closely resembles a mini royal commission, in that it is an investigative body that seeks out information and makes recommendations. It does not provide judgments nor verdicts, and the outcome is weighted opinion only and the advice non-binding. However, the Defence Department has taken upon itself another privileged position inside the DHAAT process. It has assumed an adversarial orientation. This opposing role has become normalised by use and in practice does not serve the interests of justice. The veterans pursuing claims against their historical service are not defendants, and having an adversarial party sitting on the sidelines kibitzing opinions which they refuse to back up by sworn testimony is the height of unfairness. During the RCB Tribunal process, the Defence Department did not once take the stand and give sworn evidence. In refusing to do so, they failed to permit the veterans to cross-examine their many declarations and statements about the veteran position. when the department made their many disingenuous opinions, such as RCB service being identical to peacetime service, with that of any garrison duty in Australia, the veterans should have had the opportunity to explore and dismantle that worldview with the department on oath. Of course, this was denied to the RCB veterans. On the other hand, the RCB veterans made themselves available to taking the stand and gave ample opportunity to undergoing cross-examination by all parties. The veterans even provided external witnesses who also gave sworn testimony and who also underwent questioning. The department not only declined having their version tested, they also provided no witnesses. In what way is this circumstance fair? In what way is justice served? The department has reserved the right to sit in an adversarial role and never had to either formally defend its position nor prove its case. As the Tribunal said in its report, that colloquially speaking, defence has been making up as it goes. You can see that on page 83 of the Tribunal report. RCB veterans do not have a problem with the Defence Department participating in the process. In fact, the Tribunal could not function without their input, given that they are the umbrella body constituting the fundamental elements of the RCB experience. Apart from anything else, most of the available data on Butterworth originally came from the Defence Department. Unfortunately, Defence, when they did produce evidence, were most keen to highlight any defence document that mentioned the word training and downplay or ignore any document that mentioned the word threat. This selective use of available data is simply unfair and unacceptable. There are not too many alternatives to the suggestion that if Defence were to comply with the Tribunal's request, they would end up supporting the veterans' position that service in Butterworth was undoubtedly warlike. Of a more serious nature, an expert witness called before the Tribunal and one who gave damaging evidence against the department's peacetime service position for RCB service was subsequently approached by the Defence Department. This witness was also a reserve military officer. This witness was advised that they should no longer appear before the Tribunal by the representatives of the Defence Department. It seems that this expert witness was damaging the department's case. The department therefore interfered with the Tribunal's judicial process and pressured the witness to withdraw from the proceedings. This is beyond outrageous, but the Tribunal did nothing when it was so informed. This was a serious miscarriage of justice, and in any other investigative commission it would be a contempt of proceedings. If no other indication of unfairness was apparent, then this one instance, it would be enough to call the entire process into question. The department's corporate sense of moral judgment is unbalanced and signals that the advice it gives to the minister behind closed doors is probably not only unfair, but also unsafe. I'd now like to get to the sticky matter of the 1993 Australian Cabinet decision. This was apparently a major reason as to why the Tribunal decided to go against warlike service for the RCB veterans. That a decision made 4 years after the conflict ended to hold so much weight is absurd. Even more so, at the time, the decision wasn't meant to be retrospective. The Tribunal plainly states about the 1993 Cabinet decision, and I'll quote, "While the Cabinet submission, to which that decision responded, did state that the proposed definitions should apply to conditions of service for future overseas ADF deployments, it contained no such qualification in respect to veterans' entitlements or medallic recognition." In other words, the 1993 decision was designed to address conflicts of the future, not the past. Given that so much of the Tribunal's rejection of the veteran claim for warlike service seems to rest upon the 1993 Cabinet decision, it might be a good idea to re-examine this particular decision in detail. The 1993 decision doesn't say a great deal about our service, and not much all about the characteristics of warlike service at all. And what the apparent intention does say about service in general, it applies itself more to subjects such as allowances and entitlements. The Tribunal appears to be looking at the decision and expanding a whole host of grey areas not explicitly mentioned. If we are going to be judged by such a ruling made in 1993, we should be able to see the inherent principles explaining as to why our service isn't warlike by definition. As to me, I can't see how the 1993 decision is entirely deterministic in itself, as it pertains to describing our service. Broadly so, perhaps, but too much unsaid opaqueness allows for post hoc interpretation. The 1993 decision was not strictly built upon determining what was warlike service for its own sake. It was primarily designed as a compromise between several different government departments, with the intention of having a method of maintaining budget allocations. How does a methodology for sorting out budget considerations get to become a determining ruling about what is and what is not warlike? Don't ask us, ask the Tribunal. I believe that the Tribunal has skewed 1993 so as to give it a supreme authority over an intention not originally met. Another direct quote. While not containing a definition of what was referred to as normal peacetime service, the decision clearly recognised peacetime as a classification separate to and distinct from warlike and non-warlike. End of quote. How exactly does the 1993 Cabinet decision describe RCB service as non-warlike, or even warlike? To my legally untrained mind, it doesn't actually describe anything. The question soon becomes a matter of degree, and then soon after that, we enter subjectivity. Exploring this point further, the matter seems to rest upon the Minister declaring warlike service to be so, anyway. Let's look at the actual definition, shall we? What is actually warlike service? Warlike service, and this is a quote, is service of a kind that is determined to be warlike service by the Minister for Defence. The Minister for Defence recognised service as warlike when a person or a unit has been involved in warlike operations. Okay, so what are warlike operations? Warlike operations are those military activities where the application of force is authorised to pursue specific military objectives, and there is an expectation of casualties. So, strictly speaking, the whole question would appear to hang on these four things. 1. What the Minister determines to be warlike service. 2. Has the person or unit been involved in said operations? 3. Was the application of force authorised in pursuit of specific military objections? And 4. Was there an expectation of casualties? As far as requirements go, if the RCB correctly addressed all these specific points, then Butterworth service must be deemed to be warlike. And of the 4 requirements, our historical service only has to complete 3 of them, with the Minister's determination making the 4th. Leaving aside the Minister's determination for a moment, we might examine the other 3 criteria. Has the person been involved in said operations? Yes. Amongst other things, the RCB were already awarded the ACM, which can only be awarded for operational service. Was the application of force authorised in pursuit of military objectives? Yes. Under the conditions of the ROE, the RCB was authorised to use lethal force in pursuit of a military objective, the defence of Butterworth Air Base. 3. Was there an expectation of casualties? Yes. The CT opposition had a wide variety of military weapons, including fully automatic assault rifles and indirect fire support, as detailed in many intelligence products. If engaged by the enemy forces, casualties were not only to be expected, they were almost certain. The nature and extent of the enemy's weapon is discounted by the Tribunal as not being relevant, but we should revisit and contest this viewpoint. It was only discounted because it destroys their argument. The CTs just didn't have stones to throw at us. Discounting the enemy's military capability to cause casualties, including death, might be inconvenient to the Tribunal's argument, but the enemy were armed and on record for killing their opposition. The only remaining criterion was ministerial determination, and that should follow once all the other conditions had been met. These seem to be the only qualifications that need to be addressed, and the RCB have done so, all of them. In all this, the Tribunal did two things by basing the ruling on the 1993 Cabinet decision. It created an element out of something not originally mentioned or even alluded to, and more significantly, that thing was an unmentioned and post-stated condition that allowed them to reject the nature of RCB warlike service, where even the 1993 decision never actually characterised exactly what warlike service was beyond what is listed above. One of the subjective clauses, for instance, is that casualties are to be expected. It is never explained as to what gradient is to be applied. For that matter, what is the deterministic rule that would cover a seemingly impossible condition of expectation, given that whatever one might expect, it might never eventuate? We expect an attack and casualties, and prepared for them, but according to the Tribunal, in doing so, we never had an expectation at all. This is the legal equivalent of spag bol being thrown onto the wall to see what sticks. Nor did the Tribunal consider that any of the uncontested facts in the veteran submissions were consistent with warlike status. So, 240 uncontested veteran submissions from 140 submitters were apparently all accepted as fact, and yet still all devoid of convincing argument. Truth be told, the odds were stacked up against RCB ever receiving a completely free hearing. If 240 submissions can be dumped in the shredder, why shouldn't the veterans feel divorced from proceedings? Ignoring 240 veteran submissions was a cop-out. In a court of law, 140 eyewitnesses giving uncontested evidence, saying something actually has a meaning. This tribunal has effectively delivered an injustice unless the department wishes to contest the collective witness version with equally compelling explanations. One shouldn't be able to hack legal jurisprudence by agreeing to the fact of something and then taking it back by negating all significance. A fact is a fact is a fact. The department should be forced to cross-examine all those witnesses on matters it disagreed with so our side could explore these items more closely. For instance, if a record failing to explain an anomaly couldn't be found, why is that assumed to have originally existed in the first place? The Tribunal does this time and time again. They make an assumption, and then when they can't find the record attesting to that assumption, they say it must be lost. We are not given the same grounds. Only two JIO intelligence products produced within a year of each other apparently must stand for an entire 19 years. That is a massive assumption, particularly as it supposedly supports the veterans not reaching a AASM standard. Submission 66 by itself details a host of alternative intelligence products suggesting warlike service that were either never read or, even worse, were read and ignored. Because the Tribunal is locked inside the 1993 self-defence paradigm, the obvious CT enemy can't be Australia's enemy. Insurgency operations only a few kilometres from Airbase Butterworth are of no concern to us. All Amber Alerts, which supposedly indicate a potential imminent attack, somehow don't apply. That the Malaysian Air Force operating offensive operations from Butterworth and attacking CT bases never introduced further risk to the airbase, or to us in particular. That our situation briefings had little bearing on threat or expectation. That the shared defence planning, where we were intrinsically involved in protecting the airbase against attack, as well as RAAF families, wasn't relevant. That locking the soldier inside an inflammable armoury had no meaning or significance. That somehow wounding a non-compliant intruder was a likely outcome when using an area weapon designed to fire at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. In other words, forget the illustrating context in all its rich detail and just go with the self-defence subplot. After hearing all this, I am convinced that if one of our RCB deployments actually had the misfortune of undergoing an insurgent attack, even if Australian casualties resulted from the action, this tribunal would somehow work the 1993 decision into it being a discounting condition. This tribunal had all the necessary information to conclude that RCB was indeed warlike, but it got stuck on a technical and theoretical choke points. Or perhaps it simply lost its nerve. In the next and concluding episode, we shall delve into what I call vital points. In doing so, I shall wrap up all things RCB and hopefully tie the mystery up with a beautiful bow. I shall try to explain some of the great unknowns of the Second Malaysian Emergency. Yes, it will involve a few speculations, but unlike the tribunal and departmental speculations, it will be supported by the available evidence. I'm talking grounded evidence. Thank you for listening to the RCB podcast. We are privileged that you have taken an interest in this part of our military and political history. So very few have. We have nothing on our side other than public opinion to help us. Nobody in government cares. This has been a production of the RCB Veterans Group. The podcast was written and produced by myself, Sean Arthur. I would especially like to thank the tireless efforts of the RCB Research Group, who have brought a level of professionalism in driving our collective efforts to the government's doorstep. I would also like to thank the RCB Veterans Group, who have been taking on the veteran fight for a very, very long time, especially at a period when the RCB space was mostly vacant. Both veteran groups have shown no lessening of resolve, even as the years roll on. And lastly, with continuing thanks to the 9,000 Australian Army veterans who served at Rifle Company Butterworth between 1917 and 1989. Thanks for listening.